Welcome to this presentation. My name is Guillem Belmar and I will be talking about the role of translation in language revitalization. More specifically, how genuineness clashes with standardization when it comes to translating into minority languages, and I will be doing so from the perspective of the Basque language. First, a little bit of background information on the Basque language. It is spoken in parts of northern Spain and southern France. It has been co-official in Spain since 1979 in some regions. It has no official recognition in France. It's an isolated language. It's an ergative language. It's heavily inflected with high dialectal divergence, and it has around 800,000 speakers, which means 25% of the population of the Basque-speaking area. Throughout its history, translation has played a key role in Basque literature. In 1571, the first texts in prose printed in Basque were actually 3 translations, which were done mainly in the Navarrese-Labortan dialect, but the author, John Leizarraga, tried to use elements from different varieties to be understood more widely, which could be seen as a beginning for standardization of the Basque language. But actually, the Basque language wasn't standardized until much later on. In 1968, the Euskaltzaindia, the Academy of the Basque Language, started putting together what was to be the standard model. We can see here in the slide some dialectal differences, for example, where you attach the article suffix, the a. So you've got different vowel harmonies, you've got different auxiliary verbs, but the standard always tried to be as logical as possible. Translation had already begun all this process, but we can see definitely that translation has helped spread this model, especially from the 1980s onwards. However, with standardization, there came what some people have labeled easy Basque. A Basque that's not genuine, that's standard, that is formal but sounds out of place in informal situations. There's a scarcity of registers when you translate using just the standard. Here we have just an example, the pronoun e, which is familiar, it's colloquial use for second singular person, and it's grammatically very complex, so non-native speakers do not use it, because it exponentially increases the verbal paradigm. It's used in autochthonous literature, but not in translation, as noted by Barambones' study in 2012. Here we can see some examples with E. We've got the same sentence, have you had a nice holiday? And the answer, yes, I have had a nice holiday. I have met a guy's son, with su, the neutral or formal register, and e with the colloquial register. We can see that the treatment e changes the verb, but also that it inflects differently. We've got 2 different verbs, for example. Instead of ibili nice in the answer, we've got ibili nauk if we're talking to a man, but ibili naun if we're talking to a woman. This is a very, very noticeable way of marking register, but sadly it's not used in translation because it's considered informal and therefore non-standard. And this, among other examples, brings us to what we call the linguistic orientation problem. Linguistic orientation was defined by Sabalba-Escobar as the use of the appropriate register in each situation, especially with literary characters whose speech determines important personality traits. Paradoxically, in minority languages, without a standard, we've got a situation rich in informal or colloquial registers, and therefore linguistic orientation is normally achieved with uneducated characters, with lower classes, working classes, whereas when we have a minority language that's been standardized, it is still rich in informal and colloquial registers, but these are avoided because they are not standard, and we want to publicize, we want to spread the standard model, so they are avoided. And thus, linguistic orientation is achieved, if it is achieved at all, with educated characters, with characters from the higher classes of society, who, in some cases, in the case of minority languages, are less likely actually to speak the language. So it is a very, it is a paradoxical situation as far as linguistic orientation is concerned. Plus, if you add bi or multilingualism to the equation, because most speakers, of minority languages are actually bi or trilingual, so they live in a bi or trilingual context where they use 2 or 3 or even 4 languages every day. So this is reflected in their autochthonous literature, but it is not reflected in translation. It should not be reflected in translation, because translation, by definition, has a monolingual result. So when we have to translate into a minority language, we've got a very strange situation. We've got a language without the standard, which will likely show high degree of linguistic interference. That means a lot of borrowings from the dominant language. It will be a text that will be highly bilingual or even trilingual, with different words that are not actually words from the language. For example, in the case of Basque, we've got a lot of catarro, for example, which means cold, but it's a Spanish loan word. It's not the Basque word for cold. Also, these translations with a high degree of linguistic interference will be widely accepted in the community because it is the way we speak. That's what people would say. This is how I say things, so it's genuine in the mind of the reader. Even though it is actually bi or trilingual, it's not what the translation should be, but it's the way we speak, so it is genuine. However, this helps spread language submission because it helps spread loanwords. It helps spread interference, not needed interference. Okay, because not all interference is bad. But a bilingual translation, or a translation that is highly interfered linguistically, helps spread language dominance. When we have a language that's been standardized, we have a more pure language, and therefore we have a monolingual text, which sounds good. This is what translation should be. For example, in the case of Basque, instead of using catarro, we'll use otzeri, which is the word for cold in Basque. But this is not how people say it, so it has a low degree of acceptability. People do not accept this because they see it as prosthetic, they see it as ungenuine. It does help spread a pure academic version of the language, yes, but it's got a very limited reach because people do not accept it. Therefore, our goal should be to reach a middle ground, something in the middle, something that people can identify with, something that is genuine, something that, as one of my professors used to say, something that my grandma, who is a speaker of the language, obviously, could have said. But at the same time, something that is correct, that is pure, that it's not interfered, that it's not submissive to the dominant language and the dominant culture in the area. In the case of Basque, it's been achieved somehow. It's not exactly there. There's a lot of work to do in both literary translation and audiovisual translation. There's still a lot of work to do in terms of registers, in terms of richness of the language. That is there. It's just that it's not used in formal settings. But this work has already started. It is being done. However, people still do not accept translations in Basque because they see them as non-genuine. Translation has definitely helped the Basque language revitalize. It's helped creating new structures, creating new settings for the language, serve as a sort of laboratory to test the language, to test the new standard. But there's still a long way to go to get the social acceptability in the community that would be needed for it to be really the source of the standard. However, I would like to finish with Mendigudin's words about translation in the Basque language. He said that translation is constantly widening the linguistic horizons of our own language, revitalizing it by means of the creation of new words and exerting a constant influence on its grammatical and semantical structures, while serving as a vehicle for new stylistic models. So, translation has created new settings for the language and has allowed us to play with the language, to play with this new standard and see what works and what doesn't. In short, from being viewed as the Trojan horse of a suspicious and even deleterious exocentrism, translation has come to be progressively valued as a tool for linguistic and conceptual enrichment. Not only language, not only the Basque language, but also the Basque culture has been enriched by translation, and this is something that happens anywhere in the world, with any culture, not just minority languages, any language in the world. In our case, the Basque case, not only has translation been tightly linked to revitalization, but it has also become the symbol of its modernization, both inspiring numerous works of lexical restructuration and developing totally new registers and discourses. Basque translation has allowed Basque speakers, to create a language that they can use to talk about science. They translate things about. They've translated books by Aristotle. They've translated books by Darwin. They've translated literary works from around the world, and this has definitely helped shape the Basque language today and revitalize it and give it the pride needed to go on that journey we talked about before to genuineness and standardization at the same time. Thank you very much for your time. These are the two works I cited during this presentation, and you've got my Twitter account, both of my Twitter accounts and my academia.edu profile there if anyone wants to contact me and discuss this topic further. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming.